This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Glynn Tonsor, K-State livestock economist, kicks off the show with the cattle market update, discussing market fundamentals, harvest capacity, and a recent policy development. Continuing the show is K-State beef reproduction specialist Sandy Johnson and K-State cropping systems and forage agronomist John Holman to chat about the concerns with high levels of nitrates and prussic acid in forages for livestock. They explain what causes the high levels and how livestock will react if they consume dangerous quantities of the nitrates or prussic acid. Sandy and John also end the show with this conversation. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Monday show with a cattle market update from K-State livestock economist Glynn Tonsor. Glynn, thanks for joining us today.
Oh, my pleasure, and happy week to you, Shelby.
Glynn, as we're looking at the cattle market, is there a report that we did not receive recently?
Yeah, that's not a fun way to kick off our discussion, but Kansas fed cattle was not reported in its typical manner by USDA this past week. Our listeners usually just take that for granted and for good reason, because USDA is usually able to regularly report the fed cattle market in major production states, including Kansas. There's a history of challenges in Texas, and now we have an example here very recently in Kansas, where the confidentiality protocols that USDA has in place that allow them to report on the market without giving away the private business of the specific entities in that region, in this case the state of Kansas, kept them from reporting this past week. I'm highlighting that simply to say it does happen. There's protocols in place for that, and you and I are not going to talk about a Kansas fed cattle price this past week because of it.
Does that make a big impact for our Kansas producers?
Well, it certainly can, right? I mean, it's, as I said, most producers and more generally users, as both buyers and sellers of fed cattle, kind of take for granted that they're going to get a weekly Kansas fed cattle price. And that's okay, again, for good reason. History says that's a pretty reasonable assumption over time. The challenge would be, right, if you were doing business, trying to figure out the value of your cattle, if you had a contract tied to it and so forth, you now have to do something different. So maybe you look at the relative spread between Nebraska and Kansas normally, and you use that to infer what Kansas market was, or you jump to the broader 5 market average and so forth. There are alternatives, but they aren't the same as maybe you were using the week before. So is it an issue? Yeah, it is something that the industry has to adjust to. It's very hard for me sitting here today with you, Shelby, to tell you, is this going to be a repeat challenge? Like, will we have this again in the week ahead and 2 weeks ahead and so forth? Kind of by definition, that's possible, but it hasn't become a persistent issue in Kansas yet, so I'm not ready to declare that.
And today, kind of talking about a bunch of different topics we've talked about over the past few weeks and bringing them all together, and starting with the fundamentals. How are things looking when we think about the cattle on feed report and just our overall market?
Yeah, indeed, we're going to work towards the latest news, but I think it's important to back up and get some of the not quite so latest news, and it's the boring supply fundamentals. That's the role of the cattle on feed report here today. They more or less reaffirmed the animals coming into and going through the feedlot system are shrinking in number. The specific numbers are out there. The 2% increase in inventory gets a little bit of attention, but the much bigger discussion in my mind is around the declines in both placements and marketings in July. That, the animals in the system coming through is shrinking in number. And that's very confirming, I think. Some would say that was bullish for the market because tight supplies would be bullish for fed cattle prices. There's been a lot of other shocks to the market, so it's hard to separate. But I'll introduce one other supply fundamental point that's not the cattle on feed report, but is related. And it's the KSU focus on feedlot data pointing to trends over time. And specifically, if you compare 2025 to 2010, we have nearly a 1/3 increase in the amount of weight added per steer. And we have 45 to 47 days more on feed on average over that 15-year period. I'm interjecting it, Shelby, because it's not new. It's not just this year. It's not even just this administration, that the cattle industry is adapting to fewer animals, putting more pounds on per animal in the production system. So the end result is U.S. consumers are seeing more beef pounds available to them than you would otherwise see given the herd size from the past. So the industry is adapting to get the most pounds per animal in the system. Cattle on feed report and tight animal herd head count just reaffirms that's likely to continue.
And what is another way you see that market adapting?
So the other one that's less fun to talk about would be the packing plant closure announcements. Again, when I refer to this, I'm referring to entities that buy cattle leaving the feedlot, just to be clear, and they do the harvesting to give us wholesale beef items, a whole suite of beef items. And in the last 10 days, there's been multiple announcements of plant closures and intended plant closures. And then if you go back to the Lexington, Nebraska announcement very early this year, you have up to maybe 10,000 head of equivalent daily capacity that's been either announced or already coming offline here during 2026. So that is definitely a major adjustment underway nationally. The economic impacts of that are going to vary a lot regionally, depending on how close you are to one of those facilities and the implication that has for you. Obviously, if you're a worker there, the implications are clear in the adjustment to maybe work at a different plant and so forth. But if you're a feedlot selling to these facilities, your proximity to the facilities that are announced is going to have a big impact on your own realized, economic impacts. But I'll interject here. Some of this is not surprising. It's not fun to talk about, but the market signals have been for some time. We have way more shackle space, packing capacity than cattle. And that statement is not new and is expected to hold for the foreseeable future. That weighs on packing margins. And ultimately, it's not surprising it leads to business announcements such as losing of shifts and eventually plant closures.
In past years, then, did we slowly see that harvest capacity grow, and now we're just having to give in to market signals and go back down in size?
So there's examples of growth in individual plants that have been added, and there's even some announcements of that coming in the future. So there's both some added and some being removed. It can be confusing. But the long-term trend, long-term, think 30, 40 years here for a moment, is the majority of the national capacity to harvest cattle was built multiple decades ago. And this is really important to highlight because a fair amount of that infrastructure is older. I mean, there's been maintenance and tweaks over time, but the core building, like the original concrete, think of it that way, was poured multiple decades ago. And it was quote unquote right sized for an industry that was much larger in terms of headcount going through feed yards. The most common thing that I could say over the last 30, 40 years is we've had more hooks than cattle because the number of cattle in the system has continued to decline. The long-term decline in the breeding herd has led to fewer animals going through feedlots. The reduction in beef production is not directly followed, per my earlier comment. Industry efficiency gains have offset a lot of the headcount decline. So this is a complement to the industry, and the consumer hasn't seen the full brunt of the headcount decline because of it. That's really important to keep in mind here. But your capacity versus cattle kind of question, I purposely take it to multi-decade because it's not a new challenge. It's been around for some time.
We've discussed cattle on feed and harvest capacity. And what is some more recent news that you're seeing impact the cattle market?
Yeah, perhaps the most recent, you and I were talking here on Monday morning. I was giving a talk last Friday morning here on campus at Risk and Profit Conference. And, before the market opened, the market was attempting to react to an announcement by President Trump. I believe the announcement was like the night before, really late on Thursday night or Friday morning, however it came in, but while the markets were closed. And it was an announcement of an easing of the rules or the protocols for importing additional ground beef, was the way it was phrased. Maybe up to 300,000 metric tons could come in with a waiver of out of quota tariffs, so it wouldn't have the same restrictions around it. Some comments about those pounds coming in at a reduced price, something below the market. It's hard for an analyst like me to react in any concrete way until some of those details are clarified. So I don't exactly know what the price is going to be on those products, exactly what countries they're going to come from, exactly what the products themselves are going to be. And equally importantly, but not talked about a lot, how many of those pounds would have been coming anyhow, and therefore it's not a net increase in the volume of imports. So there's still a lot of uncertainty about the realization of what happens after this announcement. But regardless, to put some context on, if 300,000 metric tons does come in that wasn't going to, think of it that way for a moment for simplicity, that would amount to about 2.5, so 2.5% of our expected U.S. beef consumption. So it would be an increase in beef pounds on the market, but a small increase is what I'm trying to impress on folks. So in aggregate, from a consumer, like U.S. resident going to the grocery store kind of perspective, I expect the impacts to be fairly small. The market reacted quite strongly because it was a surprise that wasn't seen coming. Most commodity markets don't react favorably to policy shocks or unseen policy developments. And we definitely saw that early during the day on Friday. If you look at like the futures markets, the markets did improve by close, but some of the volatility we saw in the Friday market was, I think, the market's reaction to supply shocks in the policy front sometimes lead to market volatility.
Glynn, as we do look ahead per se through the end of this year, what are you thinking we'll be seeing for our cow-calf producers in Kansas?
Yeah, so most importantly, supply fundamentals, in my opinion, have not changed in aggregate. Remember the cattle on feed comment, the animals in the system, and then put the most recent possible import change in context as a percentage of consumption. The supply fundamentals haven't changed. Is an aggregate kind of point. Lots of discussion and interest in herd expansion hasn't gone away, but it's discussion and not action on balance so far. So, I mean, there's individual signals of possibly like putting a floor in on the herd, so to speak, but not massive heifer retention that I'm aware of, the data that I see. And I think that's producers being cautious. It's hard to say that's irrational, given there's definitely elevated risk, uncertainty, unpredictability is the phrase I was using a lot in my talk last week. It takes out even higher economic carrot of expected returns to pull the trigger on an investment, in this case, herd expansions and a multi-year investment, if you think the risk environment is elevated. So it takes a bigger expected return to offset the elevated risk to rationally pull the trigger on that investment. And the more I talk to producers, the more I hear them. All right, they may not use those exact same words that I do, but that's what's in their mind. And I think that describes the business environment for a lot of cattle producers today.
Glynn, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Yep, my pleasure. Thanks for having me on, Shelby.
That was K-State livestock economist Glynn Tonsor. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show discussing nitrate toxicity and prussic acid with K-State beef reproduction specialist Sandy Johnson and K-State cropping systems and forage agronomist John Holman. Sandy, John, I appreciate both taking the time to join us today.
Glad to be here.
Shelby, always a pleasure.
John, as we're thinking about nitrates, what makes the levels get to somewhere that's dangerously high?
Well, the crop stress will increase nitrate levels, and also excess fertility can cause that too. So, we think about this year and our summer, we put up a lot of, might be putting up a lot of corn. Maybe there's some field corn being chopped in western Kansas, and we'll be harvesting forage sorghum. Both of those summer crops types can have increased nitrates when we have drought stress, and especially if we had more nitrogen available to the crop than it can utilize.
Are there plants that are more susceptible to high levels?
There are. We have measured high nitrates, for example, in wheat and triticale in the past, but we don't tend to think of those as being nitrate accumulators. Our summer crops, anything in the sorghum Sudan family, millet, corn, oats, we tend to associate those being higher in nitrates than some other species. Also, some weeds can also be high in nitrates. If we have cattle turned in, maybe where there's a bunch of palmer amaranth, for example, those weeds can also be very high in nitrates. So we need to be mindful there too. If cattle are maybe turned into a set of corrals that have had a bunch of weeds growing up in it where there's lots of manure. We've had toxicity issues in that case as well. So not only crop, but also weeds can be a problem.
At what level does it become dangerous?
Well, that might be a good question for Sandy. There's different levels, whether that animal is bred or open, but I'll let Sandy kind of maybe cover that aspect. That kind of gets into the animal side of things.
Yeah, so the thing we have to realize about determining whether something is toxic based on the amount of nitrates in it is there's at least 3 tests, 2 more commonly used now. So, and each of those have a different scale. Okay, so you want to know what test is being used and what the scale is. And generally, wherever you have that test, it comes with recommendations on it. Now, recommendations from Nebraska, Missouri, Iowa State are not all exactly at the same level. And, there's a lot we don't know. So those are guidelines. And then within that, we generally think about three main categories. So under this level, we think it's safe. Then there's kind of a moderate level that we don't want to use for like pregnant cows or any type of stressed animal. And so pregnant cow could be viewed as stress from carrying that pregnancy. And so we want to limit that amount in the ration. And then there's a, really high level that's like, they eat this, they're probably going to tip over. So, you'll find that when you do the test. And so the thing to think about when we're trying to prevent poisoning is that it can be variable in the field. John's mentioned the fertility differences, and we know that different soil types, field is not all equal. And so we want to do a really good job of sampling, whether we're sampling something standing in the field or the bales that came out of that field to test for nitrates. And it could be that we want to segregate some of that forage based on, this was in the side hill, this was in the terrace channel. And, if we can segregate some of that based on how it appears to us, we might test two different things and use that two different ways.
You made a mention of pregnant cattle. Is that the type of cow you have the most concerns for when it comes to nitrate toxicity?
Yes. And, the thing we've learned from the veterinary diagnostic lab is that anywhere from 10 to 20% of the abortions that they are asked to diagnose are from nitrate toxicity. And those, are coming without any visible, the cow is fine, but she aborts. And the most recently, the problem has been that oats wrapped up in a bale were not tested, and they can be very high. We think a lot about all our things in the Sudan family, but oats can be, very high. And so in Kansas, if you're feeding it, test it. Cattle are worth too much not to spend $20 to figure out whether or not there's high nitrates in that feed stuff.
Sandy had mentioned, what the levels are and how we manage that. So, and the time to do that is really before we put it in before we harvest it. So, go out there a week ahead of when you're thinking it's time to harvest, and measure that, because, if we measure it and we know what it is, we can manage around it. But if we don't measure that, then it makes it more difficult to manage. And so let me give you just one example. When we talk about nitrates tend to accumulate much higher in the concentration in the base of the plant than the upper portion of the plant. So, one management technique we can do real easily is just raise the cutter bar height. I mean, we can take feed that could be considered toxic, and if we cut that at about a 10 to 12 inch height, we could make that feed a lot more safe. That's if you don't have other management tools available to you to manage that. If you chop it and then sile it versus putting it in dry hay, that will cut the level in about half. So there are things we can do to manage through it. Like I say, I can't stress enough to measure it so you know what you're working with.
But I want you to still measure it again before you feed it in whatever form it is. Measure it to make the decisions at harvest time, but then let's sample again. Now, it's not going to necessarily go away in the bale, but sometimes I talked about sampling. Let's make sure we haven't made a sampling error and just feed it straight out without checking it again.
As we've discussed nitrates, also wanting to talk about prussic acid. And what is prussic acid?
Sure. So prussic acid in the animal produces cyanide, and that can also cause toxicity problems. only the sorghum sudan. Well, I shouldn't say only, but most often the prussic acid concern is associated with sorghum or sorghum sudan. Millet does not have prussic acid. There is a new prussic acid free sorghum sudan that's been released on the market. It also will not have prussic acid. So typically, with prussic acid, once we put that in a bale or in silage, those levels it dissipates and is not an issue. Although occasionally we can have a problem. So, like Sandy said, it'd be important to measure that before feeding it. Where we normally see issues with prussic acid toxicity is cattle grazing prussic acid. Prussic acid tends to be at the highest concentration when plants are less than 18 inches tall. If we get some new regrowth or around the time of light frost events, that can elevate it. And usually in our falls we don't get a single killing frost that will kill it. Usually we get a frost that dings a plant and then it starts to regrow, and then we get, we can go through that cycle several times in the fall. And those, after a light frost event, our current recommendation is to wait 10 days after a light frost event before grazing. So that's kind of a high summary of prussic acid.
Sandy, from your cattle perspective, what does it do to the livestock that makes it so toxic to them?
Well, this is where it's similar to nitrate poisoning in that it involves how oxygen is or isn't transferred in the body. And so with nitrates, it's more of a slow process, but with the prussic acid, or, the word cyanide poisoning is also used. And so, they take a bite and they're gone. It's just, there's not going to be much treatment there unless, it just not much you're going to do. And so interferes with oxygen transport and essentially they die very quickly. Whereas with nitrates, they can actually learn to tolerate a little bit more. And, if they get a high level amount, it's usually not going to be an immediate death. It'll occur after several hours.
That was Kansas State University's Sandy Johnson and John Holman. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but when we come back, we'll once again be joined by Sandy and John. You're tuned back into Agriculture Today, and we continue our show and conversation with K-State Beef Reproduction Specialist Sandy Johnson and K-State Cropping Systems and Forage Agronomist John Holman as they continue discussing nitrate toxicity and prussic acid. Sandy, in the last segment, we mentioned how nitrate levels can be very variable across the field, and is that something we also see when it comes to prussic acid?
Well, I think we do in that, I think where we might commonly see this as a concern might be in the fall. If we're getting some regrowth from suckers, we decide that we're going to go out and graze some milo residue, and there's been a little regrowth, and so we got something like that. Or even some of our forage sorghums, a little bit of regrowth. Maybe we're just walking by there and there's this little stuff that looks all nice and tempting, but it could be, very high in prussic acid. And I think we don't always talk about this enough. We think once the hay, if we make hay of it and it's dry, the prussic acid is totally gone. Well, if it's high enough initially, it doesn't seem to go away. Okay, so if the conditions, small and stressed, fit what you're, feeding there, prussic acid could still be a problem in hay. It's not common, but it does happen.
If we have high levels then of nitrates or prussic acid, and we've tested per se a bale of hay, What do we need to do with it if we aren't comfortable feeding it to our cattle? Or is there a way that we can still feed it to our cattle?
Well, it really depends on how high it is. Dilution is often the way we're going to handle that, but we have to do dilution. We can't put a bale of alfalfa and a bale of this high nitrate, whatever there and say, well, be careful. That's not going to work. And, a lot of times we're grinding a bale of this and a bale of that, and that may not get it quite as mixed as what we might like either. So we need to be cautious on that approach. And there's been times when we've had forage that's so high that we don't really have the management ability to feed the small amount that it would allow you to feed and actually be safe. And so in that case, it becomes something to work into the field as more organic matter. And hopefully that doesn't occur very often, but it does occur.
What's the key thing then that you'd really like producers to keep in mind?
Just remember to test, and don't guess.
Perfect. Sandy, John, I appreciate you both taking the time to join us today.
Thank you.
That was Kansas State University beef reproduction specialist Sandy Johnson, and she was joined by Kansas State University cropping systems and forage agronomist John Holman as they discussed nitrate toxicity and high levels of prussic acid for livestock. If you missed the first part of our conversation with Sandy and John on this topic, you can find it by going online to agtoday.net, or you can simply search for Agriculture Today on your favorite podcast platform. If you are wanting to read more on this topic, you can do so by following the couple of links in today's show notes on agtoday.net. The first one will link you to an e-update article titled Be Aware of Nitrate Toxicity in Drought-Stressed Forages. You can find this for yourself also by going to agronomy.k-state.edu/e-updates. Once again, that is agronomy.k-state.edu/e-updates. This article is in the August 13th publication. If you're wanting to read more about prussic acid, you can do that by going to K-State Research and Extension's bookstore and finding the publication Prussic Acid Poisoning. That website is bookstore.ksre.ksu.edu. Once again, that's bookstore.ksre.ksu.edu, and this is publication number MF3040. That is all we have for you today on K-State's Agriculture Today, but I do look forward to being back with you tomorrow.